Hi all, today we're going to be talking about the A7 weapons, and in general the black market, what I think you should get, and what I think you should definitely stay away from. So now that A7 is a relatively limited resource, this is the only way to acquire it frequently is through daily missions, and in which case you're looking at give or take 100 to 200 a day, kind of depends honestly, if you get good missions, if you get bad missions, if you're a member, if you're not a member, etc. So now that it's in fairly short supply, I want to give my advice on what things I think are worth unlocking here, what I think is worth your time, and what I think is absolutely skippable. And here's a hint, there's a lot of really skippable things here. We'll start at the top left and we'll work our way to the bottom right. The Showdown. The Showdown is... I think it's a very safe skip. Essentially what you're looking at here is a black hand that doesn't have an optic on it. Outside of that, they feel fairly similar, and honestly, it feels like a downgrade on the black hand in a lot of ways. Ultimately, if you need a ranged pistol, you're better off bringing the black hand because then you get the 4x, and if you're just looking for a general 450 damage revolver, the Commissioner does it all better. It's not the worst thing ever, it is fun to mess around with, I'll give it that. It is a fun pistol, but I think on a technical level, I don't think it's worth your A7 unless you're really, really into pistols. The 357 IA is okay. It's one of the better weapons in here, and it's just kind of okay. Essentially what it is an underboss that fires two 250 damage pellets at once, and it's okay. In theory, if you headshot both pellets within 2 meters, you can't one-shot headshot anyone. However, good luck actually doing this in live play. It can happen, and if it does, it's funny, but most of the time, it's just a worse underboss, unfortunately. That said, it still is an underboss at the end of the day, and it does have its uses. It still works reasonably okay as a backup pistol, just sometimes hip spread can mess you up. It's alright, I don't think it should be the first thing you buy, but I think it's justified, and if you're going to complete the black market directive, I think it's here. And for that regard, if you don't like other weapons, the Showdown is okay for that directive as well, because we'll put that into the list as well. Shortbow is essentially an archer that's been given slightly more damage output in burst in exchange for worse overall sustain, worse range, and you don't have a 4x or bigger scopes. It's okay. Unfortunately, the new anti-material rifles in the Archer make it a fairly redundant purchase. At the end of the day, it feels more like an Archer that's for close-range bolt-action sniping. Other than that, it's fine. I just don't think it's ultimately worth the cost. It's alright. It's nothing special. I think you can skip it. I think it should be one of your last purchases, to be totally honest, and I wouldn't even put the medal on it for the directive. Tranquility, better known as the Shitter Vandal, is a Vandal that does less damage overall and has a smaller magazine, but in exchange, you do 20% slow for 2 seconds on hit. It is a Shitter Vandal. It's not as good as the Vandal, but it's still a Vandal at the end of the day. It's fine. It's got a neat solid green camo on it. I think it's worth putting the medal on for the Iraxium, but it doesn't really offer anything unique. It's kind of just like a Vandal that has this weird slow gimmick on it. Other than that, it doesn't really do anything that the regular one doesn't do better. It's fine, but unless you're really into scout rifles or you're really trying to work on your black market directive, you can pass on it. Miramasa these are the NSX weapons, these used to be the NSO directive weapons. The Muramasa is easily the worst launcher in the game. There is pretty much zero reason to ever use it, there is zero reason to get it, it's not worth 4,000 day 7, it's not worth Iraxiuming because good luck Iraxiuming it. It is genuinely the worst launcher I've ever had the displeasure of using, and it's just not worth anything. It's not worth the cost. Your Decimator does better, your Masamune does better, everything does better. There's no reason ever to use the Miramasa, it's not worth the cost, it's not worth the A7, it's just, it's not worth your time. Kuwa is a little wacky, but it's generally a decent weapon. Essentially what it is it's a Yumi that you don't have to burst constantly. So you still eat that 0.25 wind-up penalty, but as soon as that's going, you're 750 at 150 until you let go of the trigger. It's decent. Notably, you can use it on Engineer and Heavy Assault because it's considered a hybrid rifle instead of an assault rifle like the regular Yumi. So it has its uses. I don't think it's the best thing ever, but my friends who have used it, and people in general, seem to rate it very highly. I would still generally recommend a standard LMG or assault rifle instead, but it's fine. It's good to put the Iraxium on if you're going for the black market directive. It's fine. If you're really into rifles, this will probably be your first pick. It's decent. Kappa, I genuinely believe, is the best weapon here. It's absolutely worth the cost, it's fun to use, it's worth putting the medal on. It's essentially a Tengu that's been made not shit, and it still has problems that the Tengu shares, namely, you know, pellet spread on a submachine gun, but in general, it's fun to use, it's good, it's nice, it's comfy. Worth the medal, worth the A7, I honestly think it's the best weapon in this entire set. Yawara, unfortunately, unless you really, really like your funny auto pistols, can be safely saved until near the end. It's just not a very good pistol, unfortunately, and while it's fun having a 200 damage auto pistol, ultimately the regular pilot basically outclasses it in every way, and if you really need an auto pistol, the emissary is already available for certs and is a little more comfortable to use. It's not bad, or rather, it's not the worst thing ever, but it's very limited in its use. You could Araxime it for the directive if you're really, really needing a weapon, but I would probably skip it. It's just not anything super special, really. Sesshin is kind of wacky. If you're into weird rifles, you might like the Sesshin. It's a 375 RPM, 167 damage Tomo, essentially. It's a Tomo that fires significantly slower, but does significantly more damage. Just like the Tomo, it has no drop-off, meaning you were always a 3-headshot kill at every single range, which is very, very powerful. The problem is, the rate of fire on it is just kind of eh, and it feels a little clunky to use, even for being automatic, just because of how slow it fires. It's not a bad weapon, but it's pretty forgettable, and honestly, the regular Tomo will pretty much outclass it, or any of the other Scout rifles will pretty much outclass it. Whether I think it's worth your A7 or not largely depends. If you really, really like your Scout rifles and want something a little more unique, I think the Sesshin could be fine. Other than that, I'd put the Araxime on it probably for the Black Market Directive, and other than that, I'd just drop it. Viscount has 2 ratings here. If you're on a normal faction, it is not really worth the price, or unless you're doing the Black Market Directive. If you're on NSO, it is a mandatory pickup. So the Viscount is a Baron with a suppressor built onto it. It sure feels like a Baron with a suppressor built on. It has slightly worse damage range, and it fires slightly slower, and it has slightly different attachments available to it. You get slightly more rounds in the magazine than you do on the Baron. It's okay. It really is just a Baron that unfortunately cannot take a smart choke, and for that reason, it's okay. It's not anything special. It's about as good as all the other semi-auto shotguns. It's alright. It's nothing special. The suppressor doesn't really matter here unless you're doing some really amusing light assault gameplay. But the thing is, on NSO, if you wish to complete the shotgun directive without buying a Baron reskin, the black or the gold variant, you have to get the Viscount to have enough shotguns to complete the directive for free. Which is why I say, if you're on NSO, I honestly believe the Viscount should be your first A7 buy, because if you ever go for that directive, you need the Viscount for it if you don't want to buy another Baron skin. Outside of that, it's a fine shotgun, it's just forgettable. Stomper is kind of wacky. Admittedly, I've not seen it used much, and I've not used it much myself, but it's interesting. It's like an AV thumper that's kind of worse than infantry, but can mess vehicles. Honestly, it's a neat little tool, but I probably wouldn't recommend it. It's realistically too hard to put an Araxime on if you're looking at the directive for it. It's fine. If you really, really need an anti-vehicle primary, I guess it's fine. But other than that, your regular thumper will pretty much do the same thing better, unless you want to, like, troll tanks or whatever, in which case, honestly, just use your launcher. Infradine. Infradine is skippable. It is essentially Infravision, or the HSNV scope. It is essentially that, really, except it's a 30-second stim. Problem is, you're competing with medkits in this slot, and temporary Infravision doesn't really mean a whole lot when you can either just have an HSNV scope on your rifle, or the Infravision implant instead, and then you're not giving up medkits. It's honestly probably the very last buy. I would honestly even recommend getting the Miramasa over Infradine because it's that useless. Daredevil chassis for both the Harasser and the Flash it's funny, but I don't think it ultimately replaces Racer or Scrapper depending on your preference. You can do funky shit in the air, and that's about it. It is funny, and other than that, I wouldn't bother with it. If you don't play vehicles, these are arguably also some of the last things you'll ever want to unlock. Obviously, you can't do any directive stuff with it. If you really like driving your Harasser and your Flash, and you want a funny chassis option, they're fine. Other than that, Generally, Racer Scrapper outperforms it both in just general use, so unless you like flying with your flash or jumping with your harasser, pretty hard to justify running. Burlap camo largely comes down to, do you like burlap camo? I think it's a decent camo. That's Barren Desert. Where's burlap? Here's what burlap looks like, for example, on an NSO soldier. It's kind of like a weird brown with some weird tint on it. It's not bad. Here, I'll see if I can find a good weapon with lots of coverage. There we go. Actually, that's the standard. That looks just like the standard 15M. It's not a bad camo. For comparison, the black 15M, the burlap 15M. It's not a bad camo, and honestly, it's one of the free ways to acquire camo. So if you're really hungry for some camo on your character, I think it's fine. But if you're not in the market for camo, honestly, I think you can pretty safely ignore it. It is cheaper than the other stuff. I think it's 2,500 A7. It's been a while since I've unlocked it. So if you're really craving camo, it's not a bad option. But I think it can be pretty safely skipped. So, in order for what I'd recommend unlocking, I'd go for Kappa, Kuwa, Sesshin, Viscount, Tranq, and then realistically the other ones largely come down to personal preference. Kappa, Kuwa, Sesshin, Tranq is largely because they're the 4 best weapons in here, I would argue, and they actually offer reasonably interesting gameplay possibilities that are not terrible, or they're just fine weapons that are fine enough for the black market directive. Everything else in here, such as the Yawara, the 357 IA, the Showdown, the Shortbow, the chassis, the camo, are largely up to personal preference, what you find yourself getting use out of. For the black market directive, it is in specialty. Just pick the 6 weapons you like, pick the 6 easiest, and then you net yourself, or rather it's 5, I was wrong. Pick your 5 favorite weapons in here, and then you have a Punisher reskin. This is not a valuable directive, so unless you're really, really craving a directive unlock and you really like the black market weapons, don't worry about it. Just pick the A7 weapon you think is the most fun, but my recommendation largely goes to Kappa. Thank you all, and I will see you all another time. Bye!